Hello, my name is Patrick Hawley of relationshipsuniverse.com. This video is part 2 of a 3-part series on how to address conflict and how to have a successful conflict. And so if you haven't seen part 1, go ahead and watch that one first, and then come back and watch this one. In this video, I'm going to suggest kind of a simple model at looking at healthy relationships that involves basically 3 broad concepts. And so you could kind of view it almost like driving down a road. As you're driving down this road, the aim is to stay on this narrow road that involves healthy communication. There are 2 ditches that are very broad on both sides of this narrow road, which we tend to fall into. And the two ditches are neediness, you could say it that way, and avoidance. Or you could say attachment, which is probably driven by expectation or demand or requirement. You can hear the attachment language or sense of that when there's expectation and demand. Or detachment, where there's disengagement, aloofness, kind of an indifference or avoidance of things. So we're trying to drive a wedge between neediness, requirement, and avoidance. And the healthy way to do that is to kind of walk that narrow road, that razor's edge of listening to one another and being differentiated and yet connected, accepting one another, leaving room for the other person to be themselves, and yet allowing myself to disagree with them without having to reject them, so that we're staying in that sweet spot of accepting the other person, agreeing to disagree, and having communication to try to work toward a solution that doesn't involve those 2 extremes of requirement and expectation and avoidance. So I want to go a little more detail into some of the qualities of attachment or neediness. Some of the kind of characteristics that involves, so you can kind of notice it in yourself when it happens, is there's a natural gravitation toward conformity, as opposed to the other ditch of detachment, which is there's a gravitation toward separateness. Because we don't want conformity and we don't want separateness. What we want is 2 people who disagree but love each other and are working toward a solution. And so if we don't allow for that, then we'll tend to go to these other 2 ditches. So with attachment, there's this gravitation toward conformity. There's neediness, there's a sense in which expectations drive it. And a lot of times our expectations are really not conscious that we have, but an argument, if you think about it, an argument or an escalation in negative feelings implies an expectation. So I encourage you to look inside yourself. What is the expectation that's driving this, that I'm putting on my spouse or my friend that's driving this thing? Now, some people will say, well, shouldn't you have expectations in a marriage? And the answer to that is absolutely not. That is part of this romantic American ideal of, oh, I just need you so much and you complete me and I just have to have you to do this or that for me so I can be happy. But that notion of relationships is completely overworked, is completely destructive. Do we need to connect? Do we need to be united? Yes, but not from a place of neediness, not from a place of scarcity, of I have to have you to do this for me or I won't be happy, but from a place of giftedness. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later, that being a free gift instead of a requirement. This aspect of attachment often involves harsh tone. You can see how harsh tone implies a kind of expectation or an attachment approach to things. It also involves often a tendency to criticize or to be aggressive in some way, to be argumentative, to be persuasive. And I will say that there's a place for persuasion, so long as both of you feel honored and accepted in the way that the persuasion is happening. Well, I feel like we ought to do A because, well, here's my reasons for it. I think because of this and this and this, but what do you think about that? That's very different from, no, we got to do it this way because if we don't do it this way, then this and this and this is going to happen. That's not really leaving space for the other person. And it also is kind of taking up the entire space and expects the other person to conform because I've made this point. And so it puts them in this position where they either have to reject you or comply. But that's not differentiation. That's not difference, and it's also not unity. Another thing I think that's implied by attachment approach or neediness approach is this idea of fixing the other person. Sometimes we get involved in this language, and I do too with my own spouse, of making these suggestions that you ought to reconsider yourself, or if you just did this, you would be happy, or if you just did this, you would think differently. We really just kind of need to stay in our own lane and work on our own description of what it is that we think that we could do, our opinion of the idea. Also, we don't want to do this thing of crossing lanes, which is meaning that I just want to use I language where I focus on me. I think this because of this, or when we do describe a conflict that involves a behavior that somebody else did, I think it's okay to use you language with that. If we just say, when you did this, I felt this way. As long as the you is descriptive and factual, and it's not inflammatory. When you treated me like an asshole, that's inflammatory. That's not kind. That's not going to be helpful. When you called me that name, that was hurtful to me. That's respectful. That's useful. So trying to get out of the you language and using I language. So that's the whole attachment side of the equation, which is in the ditch over there. Now, the other ditch is called detachment. That's my tendency. If I'm going to mess up and get out of the dialogue zone, my tendency is to get into this other ditch of avoidance or disengagement or pulling back or defensiveness on my part to pull back. And so we want to watch for that aspect. I think because the person who tends to detach or avoid, sometimes it's because they lack the emotional resiliency to stay in the communication, and I think we have to make room for that. And so if somebody is overwhelmed by emotions and needs to take a break, then you could take a break and say, will you give me 5 minutes so I can kind of gather myself, or 10 minutes, or half an hour. But the person who takes the break should always be the one to invite it back, because we don't want to leave it on the other person to have to chase you down to start the communication back again. So detachment is this gravitation towards separation that involves things like avoidance, withdrawal, stonewalling, or maybe even appeasing. Appeasing is still detachment. Appeasing is kind of, I'm going along with you, but I'm not really telling you my own perspective. And so, in other words, I'm still kind of holding myself back from you, withholding a little bit. It also sometimes involves detached emotions, where I withdraw my affections from you. So those are the two ditches of attachment and detachment: neediness and avoidance, gravitation toward conformity versus gravitation toward separateness. With the dialogue, with the dialogue zone, or that sweet spot, or that narrow road that I'm discussing, there's togetherness, but not seeking conformity, but seeking differentiation. So there is togetherness and there is differentiation, but there's no requirement and there's no running away. We keep that tension together. And so I think the way to keep that together involves things like unconditional acceptance, is to approach it, like I said in the first video, we're approaching this conflict from the perspective of, I'm just going to accept my spouse here, or I'm just going to accept my friend, and I want to know what they're saying, I want to understand them, I want to accept that, I want to give them the experience of being understood and accepted. That happens through empathy, which is to reflect back what the other person is saying, to accurately reflect back what they're saying. Now, I've done a video at another place called How to Be a Good Listener. You can go find that one, or I went into a little more detail about empathy, so I do encourage you to listen to that. Even though in our third one, I'm going to have some practical steps with that as well. Also is, in this dialogue zone, is we're deciding together. instead of letting the force of one person's personality to override the other. Let's decide together. Let's don't make this decision until we both know that we can accept it and choose this decision together freely. Not because somebody overpowers somebody else or somebody just defers their own space and chooses not to engage in this communication. And so that can lead us to maybe even defer. Sometimes that can be a solution. For instance, let's just say my wife and I are having a disagreement, and on a scale of 1 to 10, the importance of this topic is a 10 to me. And so maybe to my wife, the importance of it is a 6 to her. And so maybe after we've heard each other, she decides, you know what, it's not as important to me as it is to you, so I defer to you. Let's do it your way. Or I might do the same. It's a 10 to her, and it's a 4 or 5 to me. And I've expressed my view, I've expressed what I prefer, but you know what? It's just not as big for me as it is for you. So I'm deferring to you. I'm fine with it. Now, deferring is different from appeasement, because with appeasement, I'm not expressing my view. I'm just going along, and there's usually resentment. Whereas deferring is, I've expressed my view, you've expressed yours, and I'm just giving up my right to have to do it my way. And I'm cool with that because I feel heard by you, and I'm okay to surrender that. In relationships, we do that, but we just don't want the surrender to be forced. And we don't want it to be as a basis of manipulation. We want the surrender to be because I surrender myself to this person I love and trust, and I know they hear me and care about me. Another part, I think, of the dialogue zone is to affirm the other person, which is to say, hey, I affirm the fact that you want this thing and that you have strong desires for this opinion, and I appreciate that, and I accept that reality about you. And also affirming the other person in their best efforts to do communication, because that affirmation tends to fuel the goodwill in the relationship, whereas criticism and avoidance definitely takes the energy out of the room and depletes the motivations to stay in that conflict and to work it out together. There's also, I encourage this, in the dialogue zone, there's this development of curiosity toward what the other person thinks and wants to know. Because if you think about it, during a conflict, we usually feel this urgency to communicate what I want and what I want to be heard, which is fine, which is great to do that, that's fine. But we also want to reverse it, which is to say, hey, tell me what you think. Tell me what you feel. It might be different from mine, but I want to hear about it because you're my person. You're the person that I love, and so put it out there. And so there's that invitation there. And so we want to use let's language. Let's decide this together, as opposed to you do that and I do this. Let's use inclusive language. And then finally, I would just say we want to use invitational language. If we feel like at the end of all of this process that we're not making any progress, or that my spouse has hurt me and I don't feel like we're resolved, then we can use invitational language, which is to say, hey, I'm feeling still a little hurt by this and I don't feel like we're resolved, and I just want to let you know how this has affected me, and is it okay if we have this conversation? Some invitational language. Now, I'm the first to say when conflict gets kind of heightened, it's hard to stay in that zone. I get it. And so it's easy for me to describe right now how to stay in that middle narrow road, and I know it's not that easy. But you know what? Even if you mess up, you can always say, hey, wait a minute, I've gotten over into the attachment ditch and I apologize. Can we start over? Or I've gotten into the detachment ditch and I'm sorry about that. Can we start over? So thank you for listening to this video. The emphasis being on being differentiated and yet connected, disagreeing, but still agreeing to disagree, versus getting in the ditches of attachment and detachment, neediness, and avoidance. Thank you for watching this one, and now I think it's a good idea to go on to video number 3 to watch the actual practical, hands-on, step-by-step effort of working through a conflict. Thanks again.